Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, glad to share another quiet inquiry with you. Tell me, is there a letter you've left unopened tonight, or a drawer of old papers you've never quite finished sorting? Watson once learned that a folded page can guard a secret longer than any lock. Do subscribe so no sealed truth escapes you. Now, settle by the lamp, for as Holmes believed, nothing written by human hand is ever truly hidden. Find us also on Spotify, Watson's Margins, link below. Chapter 1. The Gentleman in the November Fog. It has often seemed to me, in reviewing the singular cases which I have been privileged to share with my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes, that the character of an investigation is frequently foreshadowed by the weather which attends its opening. Storms herald violence, and still, clear nights often bring with them puzzles of a quieter and more intellectual sort. But of all the elements that might announce a mystery, none served Holmes so well as fog, for it was in fog, thick and yellow and pressing against the window panes of our lodgings in Baker Street, that the affair of the stolen letters of probate first came to our door. It was the latter half of November in the year of which I write, and London lay smothered beneath one of those dense, choking fogs peculiar to the season, in which the gas lamps along the street burned like dull orange moons, and the rattle of carriage wheels seemed to reach the ear from an immense and uncertain distance. I had returned to our old rooms that evening at Holmes's invitation, our respective households being, for the moment, otherwise engaged, and I found my friend seated at the table by the fire, a row of small dishes before him, each containing a disc of sealing wax of a slightly different hue. "Come in, Watson, and mind the door," said he, without lifting his eyes from his work. "You will find the shag tobacco in the Persian slipper, as always, and I would be obliged if you did not disturb my reds. I have no fewer than 11 shades before me, and I have only just persuaded myself that the 9th is not, after all, identical to the 4th. A singular occupation for a November evening," I remarked, seating myself opposite him. "Not so singular as you might suppose. Sealing wax, my dear fellow, is as individual as a signature, and rather more difficult to forge convincingly. A man may practice another's hand until it deceives the eye, but the composition of his wax, the proportion of resin to shellac, the trace of vermilion or of red lead that gives it colour, these are things not easily counterfeited by an amateur, and not always accurately reproduced even by a professional. I have been retained, in a small way, by a gentleman who suspects that a codicil to his father's will was sealed some years after the date it bears. The matter is nearly resolved, and dull enough in itself, but it has left me with a most educational collection of wax." I was about to inquire further when there came a ring at the bell below, followed by the murmur of voices, and a few moments later the heavy tread of Mrs. Hudson upon the stair, accompanied by a lighter and more hesitant step. "A Mr. Percival Wren, sir," said our landlady. "Very anxious to see you, and would not be put off till morning, fog or no fog." "Show him up, by all means," said Holmes, sweeping his dishes of wax to one side with the air of a man closing one chapter in anticipation of another. "A solicitor, Watson, or I am very much mistaken, and one in considerable distress." "How can you possibly—" I began, but the door opened before I could finish, and our visitor was announced by his own appearance before he had spoken a word. He was a young man of perhaps 30 years, dressed with the sober precision of his profession, though his collar was slightly wilted and his hair disordered, as though he had crossed half of London on foot rather than wait for a cab in the fog. His hands, when he removed his gloves, trembled a little, and there was a leather document case tucked beneath his arm which he set down upon our table, with the care of a man handling something he no longer entirely trusted himself to carry. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I must apologise for the hour, but I fear that time may be of the very first importance. My name is Percival Wren. I am junior partner in the firm of Wren, Bellamy and Pike, solicitors, of Lincoln's Inn." "Pray sit down, Mr. Wren, and compose yourself before you begin," said Holmes, in that gentler tone he reserved for those genuinely distressed, as opposed to merely dramatic. "You have come a considerable distance in haste, I think, and on a matter connected with a will or some similar instrument, for you carry about you the particular anxiety of a lawyer who has mislaid what was entrusted to his keeping." Mr. Wren looked at Holmes with some astonishment. "You know already, then?" "I know nothing whatever," said Holmes, smiling, "beyond what you have told me by your bearing. Your case bears the imprint of your firm upon its clasp, worn pale by frequent handling of one particular sort of document, and you have, if I am not mistaken, glanced at it 3 times since entering this room, as a man glances at an empty till. Pray continue." Thus encouraged, Mr. Wren told us his story, and I set it down here as nearly as I can recall his words. "Some weeks ago," said he, "our firm secured letters of probate for the estate of Sir Claudius Merivale, a gentleman well known in certain circles as a collector of some eccentricity, who died in October last without wife or child. The estate is not inconsiderable, Mr. Holmes, nearly £500,000, and passes, under the terms of the will, to his nephew, Mr. Adrian Merivale, who is named sole executor." "A substantial inheritance," Holmes observed. "Pray go on." "The formal letters of probate, once granted by the court, were placed for safe keeping in the deed room of our offices to await delivery to Mr. Merivale the following morning. They were locked within a steel dispatch box, to which only Mr. Bellamy, our senior partner, holds the key. Yesterday evening at 5:30, Mr. Bellamy placed the sealed packet within the box himself, in my presence, and locked it. At 6 o'clock, when he opened it again to show me the seal before it was sent away, the box was empty. The packet had vanished." "And in the interval?" asked Holmes, leaning forward with the sudden sharpening of interest that I had learned to recognise as the true beginning of a case. "The outer office was occupied throughout. No window was forced, no lock broken. Only 5 persons could conceivably have approached the deed room in that half hour, and I can vouch that none of them was seen carrying anything from it." "A pretty problem," said Holmes, "though I confess that the theft of a legal document which may, in most cases, simply be replaced by application to the probate registry, seems a curious object for a thief's ambition, unless he had some more particular reason for wanting it, or for wanting what accompanied it." Mr. Wren started, and I saw Holmes's grey eyes narrow with satisfaction at having, as it were, drawn first blood. "You're very quick, Mr. Holmes," said our visitor slowly. "You're quite right. The stolen packet contained also a handwritten memorandum, found among Sir Claudius's private papers shortly after his death, and placed with the probate letters at the instruction of Mr. Bellamy himself. Its contents I do not know. Mr. Bellamy has refused absolutely to explain them, even to me, though I am his partner, and he grows pale and evasive whenever the matter is raised." "Then it is not the missing grant that troubles your senior partner," said Holmes softly, half to himself, "but what travelled beside it. Men seldom steal what may be freely replaced, Mr. Wren, unless they fear a good deal more the thing that cannot be replaced at all." He rose and reached for his pipe upon the mantel. "I think, Watson, that we shall want our coats. Fog or no fog, I fancy Lincoln's Inn had better see us before the trail grows any colder than the weather has already made it." And so began, on that murky November evening, an investigation which was to lead us through the drawing-rooms of Belgrave Square and the chambers of Lincoln's Inn to a secret 30 years buried, and to teach me once again that the coldest and most respectable of documents may conceal within its folds the warmest and most dangerous of human passions. Chapter 2. The Circle at Merivale House. The fog had thinned but little by the following morning, so that the houses of Belgrave Square emerged from it only reluctantly, one by one, as our cab drew nearer, like sentences forming slowly out of a half-remembered dream. Merivale House, when at last we reached it, proved a tall and sombre building of grey stone, handsome in its proportions but touched with that peculiar melancholy which seems to settle upon a great house immediately after a death, as though the very walls were still absorbing the news. "A household in mourning wears its grief upon the brickwork, Watson," Holmes remarked as we mounted the steps, "quite as plainly as its occupants wear it upon their sleeves. Notice the black crape upon the knocker, not yet removed, and the blinds of the upper story, drawn these 3 weeks at least, if I judge the fading of the cloth aright." We were admitted by a solemn manservant and shown into a drawing-room heavy with dark furniture and heavier still, it seemed to me, with unspoken tensions among the persons gathered there. Adrian Merivale rose to greet us first. He was a well-formed young man of perhaps 26, dressed with a fashionable neatness that could not quite disguise a certain hollowness about the eyes, the mark, I have observed in my professional capacity, of sleepless nights and private anxieties. "Mr. Holmes," said he with a courtesy that seemed to cost him some effort, "you find us in a distressing time. I am told you come on account of the missing papers. I confess I care less for the parchment itself than for the delay it threatens. There are debts, Mr. Holmes, which do not wait upon the convenience of the law." His sister, Miss Eleanor Merivale, seated near the window, regarded him with an expression in which affection and quiet exasperation seemed evenly mingled. She was some years his junior, composed in manner, and answered our questions with a directness that I found refreshing amid so much evident strain. "My brother speaks too freely of his difficulties," said she, "but he does not exaggerate our uncle's temper. Sir Claudius threatened, not a month before his death, to strike Adrian from the will entirely, after a quarrel whose cause he never fully explained to me. I do not say this to accuse my brother of anything worse than folly, Mr. Holmes, but you would hear it eventually, and I had rather you heard it from me." Holmes inclined his head gravely, and I saw him mark her words with the particular stillness he reserved for testimony he judged reliable. It was Lady Honoria Vale, however, who dominated the room by the sheer force of her bearing. She was Sir Claudius's widowed sister, a tall woman of perhaps 60 years, dressed in unrelieved black, whose voice carried the practised authority of one long accustomed to being obeyed. "I will tell you plainly, Mr. Holmes, what the rest of this household is too delicate to say," she began, before Holmes had asked her anything at all. "My brother's mind was not sound in his final months. He spoke of matters that made no sense, received visitors he would not name, and altered his intentions from week to week like a weathercock. I do not say the will is invalid, but I say it should be examined, and examined closely, before £500,000 passes into hands as unsteady as my nephew's." "You believe the will might be challenged?" Holmes inquired mildly. "I believe truth ought never to fear inquiry," said Lady Honoria, with a thin smile that did not reach her eyes, and would say no more upon the subject. Dr. Stephen Carow, who had attended Sir Claudius through his final illness, offered a very different account. He was a spare, careful man, precise in speech, who chose his words as a chemist measures a reagent. "I can state without hesitation," said he, "that Sir Claudius's intellect remained entirely sound to the end. Whatever troubled him in his last weeks, it was not derangement. Yet I noticed, as I believe Holmes also noticed, that the doctor's composure faltered slightly when the final week of his patient's life was mentioned, and that he turned the conversation aside from it with a haste that seemed at odds with his otherwise deliberate manner. It was the last member of the household circle, however, who most engaged my friend's attention, though at the time I confess I thought him the least remarkable of the company. Edwin Marsh, Sir Claudius's private secretary, was a mild, sandy-haired man of middle years, neither handsome nor plain, whose manner combined an almost excessive helpfulness with a curious talent for fading from notice the moment his usefulness was exhausted. He supplied Holmes, without being asked twice, with dates, inventories, and a written list of every visitor who had called upon Sir Claudius during the final month of his life. "I wonder," said Marsh in the tone of a man offering a minor suggestion rather than a serious accusation, "whether the police have considered Thomas Rudge. He was dismissed from this household some weeks ago on a charge of pilfering, and has spoken bitterly of the family since, a man in want of money and nursing a grievance, might see profit in selling such information to the newspapers. A reasonable suggestion, said Holmes, though something in his tone told me he found it a shade too reasonable, too readily produced. Tell me, Mr. Marsh, are you well acquainted with the offices of Messrs. Wren, Bellamy and Pike? Tolerably well, Marsh answered without hesitation. Sir Claudius frequently sent me thither with documents during his lifetime, and I have carried papers to the deed room myself upon more than one occasion. You know the arrangement of the rooms, then? As well as I know this house, Mr. Holmes, said Marsh, with a faint and disarming smile, and turned to inquire whether we would take tea. We left Merivale House an hour later, and proceeded directly to Lincoln's Inn, where the offices of the solicitors presented a scene of studied gravity. Septimus Bellamy, the senior partner, was a stout, pompous gentleman whose evident distress had not diminished his sense of his own dignity. He confirmed, in answer to Holmes's direct question, that the missing memorandum concerned, as he phrased it, a private matter affecting the honour of the family, but no persuasion of Holmes's could induce him to say more. The clerk, Lionel Griggs, a sharp-featured young man with restless eyes and an ambition he made small effort to conceal, answered our questions with a smoothness I found faintly suspicious, though I could not then have said why. Miss Clara Denby, the firm's chief typist, a precise and self-possessed young woman, gave her account with such careful accuracy that Holmes remarked afterward he had rarely met a witness who volunteered so little beyond what was strictly asked of her. "We have gathered our circle, Watson," said Holmes, as our cab rattled homeward through streets still veiled in mist. 5 persons about a legal office, and 5 about a family drawing-room, and a document that binds them all together like a thread through so many separate beads. The interesting question is not who might have taken the packet, for it seems that any of several hands could have managed it. The interesting question is why a private secretary should know the arrangement of a solicitor's deed room as intimately as his own master's study, and why so unremarkable a man should trouble himself to direct our suspicion so promptly toward a dismissed footman. He said no more upon the subject that evening, but I observed that he filled and emptied his pipe 3 times before the fire burned low, and that his eyes, when at last he spoke again, held the particular brightness that told me his mind had already begun to close upon some thread invisible to my own duller perception. Chapter 3. The Empty Dispatch Box. I had expected, upon our return to the offices of Wren, Bellamy and Pike the following day, that Holmes would proceed at once to a searching examination of every person who might have entered the deed room during that fateful half-hour. Instead, he spent the better part of an hour reconstructing, with a patience that tried even my own considerable tolerance for his methods, the exact sequence of events attending the theft, questioning Mr. Bellamy upon points so minute that the solicitor's initial gravity gave way more than once to visible irritation. "At 5:30 precisely," said Bellamy, consulting his watch as though the instrument itself might corroborate his testimony, "I placed the packet within the dispatch box in the presence of Mr. Wren and locked it myself. The key has not left my watch chain since the box was made, Mr. Holmes. I can vouch for that upon my honour. And at 6 o'clock, I opened the box again in Mr. Wren's presence, intending to show him the seal before it went to the bank for the night. The box was empty. The packet had vanished as completely as though it had never existed." Holmes turned the small steel box over in his long fingers, examining its lock, its hinges, its every surface, with an attention that seemed to me almost excessive for so simple an object. During the 30 minutes in question, who entered this room? It was Percival Wren who answered, consulting notes he had evidently prepared in anticipation of the question. Miss Denby came in to replace a bundle of leases in the second cabinet, remaining perhaps 5 minutes. Mr. Griggs passed through the corridor outside, carrying the outgoing post to the pillar box. Mr. Marsh called unexpectedly, asking whether the probate papers might be delivered directly to Merivale House, rather than sent through the usual channels, to spare Mr. Merivale the inconvenience of calling here, and a messenger boy brought a telegram for Mr. Bellamy, which arrived, I believe, very near to 6 o'clock. Before Holmes could pursue this further, there came the sound of brisk and confident footsteps upon the stair, and Inspector Lestrade entered, brushing fog from his coat with the air of a man who had already solved the case and had come merely to collect the credit due him. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, I thought I might find you here," said he, with that particular blend of civility and self-satisfaction I had learned to recognise over the years of our acquaintance. "You need trouble yourself no further, I fancy. The matter is very nearly settled." "Indeed," said Holmes, without looking up from the dispatch box. "A duplicate key was discovered this morning in Miss Denby's desk," Lestrade announced, together with a torn strip of blue legal paper, matching precisely the wrapper in which the probate packet was enclosed. "The young woman has admitted that she is greatly in want of money to support a sick mother in Kent, and can offer no explanation whatever as to how the key came into her possession. I call that a very tidy case, Mr. Holmes, tidier than most that come my way. I confess that my own sympathies were stirred by the account, for there is something peculiarly affecting in the image of a respectable young woman driven to crime by filial devotion, and I saw that even Holmes's countenance, usually so impassive, softened for a moment at the mention of the sick mother. But his attention, when he spoke again, was fixed upon matters that seemed to me of far less immediate importance. "You interest me strangely, Lestrade, though not, I think, in the direction you intend," said he. "Tell me, was the duplicate key examined against the lock itself or merely against the original?" "Against the original, of course. The resemblance is unmistakable." "Unmistakable resemblance is not identity," Holmes murmured, though he pressed the point no further at that moment, and instead turned his attention to the interior of the box, running his fingertips along the velvet lining with a delicacy that reminded me of a physician palpating some obscure internal complaint. "You will find nothing there but dust, Mr. Holmes," said Bellamy, with some asperity. "On the contrary, I find a very particular sort of dust," Holmes replied, and produced from his pocket a small lens, through which he examined a faint pale residue clinging to the velvet near the hinge. He said nothing further upon the subject, but I observed him fold a scrap of paper about a pinch of the substance and place it carefully within his note-case. His next discovery interested me more, for it was one I might almost have made myself, had I possessed the habit of looking where others did not. Kneeling beside the desk that stood nearest the deed-room door, Holmes indicated a small circular stain upon the boards, no larger than a shilling, pale and faintly glossy. "What do you make of this, Watson? Spilled varnish, perhaps, or the mark of some bottle set down carelessly?" "The mark of a bottle, certainly," said Holmes, "though not, I fancy, of varnish. We shall return to it." And with that tantalizing remark he rose, dusted his knees, and turned his attention to the door-frame itself where, caught upon a small splinter of wood near the lower hinge, he discovered a tiny fragment of reddish-brown thread, coarse in texture, which he removed with a pair of forceps and examined minutely. "Ordinary cloth fibre, I should say," Lestrade observed, with the tolerant condescension of a man humouring a colleague's eccentricity. "You will find such threads caught upon half the doors in London, Mr. Holmes, if you trouble to look for them." "No doubt," said Holmes equably, though I noticed he preserved the fragment with the same care he had given the dust from the dispatch box. Before we took our leave, Holmes turned to Bellamy with a question that seemed at the time almost trivial. "One point puzzles me, Mr. Bellamy. Was the stolen packet wrapped once or twice?" The solicitor frowned, as though the question scarcely merited an answer. "Once, Mr. Holmes. A single sheet of blue legal paper folded and sealed. I cannot imagine why the wrapping should signify." "No," said Holmes quietly, "I dare say you cannot," and made no further remark upon the matter, though I saw that he had written something in his notebook, and that his eyes, as we descended into the fog-bound street, held the particular light of a man who has been told a falsehood, and has resolved, for the present, to let it pass unchallenged. "You believe Bellamy lied to you?" I asked as we walked toward the cab-stand. I believe, Watson, that a man who has spent 30 years wrapping legal documents does not mistake the number of times he has folded a sheet of paper about a valuable packet, Holmes replied. Whether the error was deliberate or the product of some more delicate consideration, I cannot yet say, but false statements, however small, are seldom without purpose, and I have found it profitable, in the course of a long career, to remember precisely who told me what, and precisely when they chose to stop telling me anything further. Chapter 4. The Footman's Red Scarf. News reached us the following morning by way of a telegram from Lestrade that police attention had shifted decisively away from the unfortunate Miss Denby. Thomas Rudge, the dismissed footman whom Edwin Marsh had named to us so readily at our first visit to Merivale House, had been arrested near Charing Cross, and a search of his lodgings had yielded, in Lestrade's triumphant phrase, evidence enough to hang the case twice over. We found the inspector at the small police station off the Strand, in a mood of considerable satisfaction, surrounded by the fruits of his search laid out upon a deal table. A red woolen scarf, its edge torn in a manner that seemed to my eye entirely consistent with the fragment Holmes had recovered from the deed-room door. A small bundle of foreign banknotes, foreign in the sense that they bore the ornate and faintly theatrical designs of no country I could readily identify, and a newspaper clipping, somewhat creased, reporting the death of Sir Claudius Merivale and the extent of his fortune. You will observe, Mr. Holmes, that the thread you found matches the scarf to a nicety, said Lestrade, holding the garment beside Holmes's fragment with an air of a conjurer completing a trick. Rudge admits freely that he bears Adrian Merivale a grudge, the young man having accused him of theft and secured his dismissal not 3 months past. He confesses, moreover, that he once threatened to expose what he calls a family scandal, though he grows sullen when pressed for particulars. A convenient confession, Holmes observed, examining the scarf with care, though a threat freely confessed is not always a threat truly meant. What is your theory, Lestrade? A simple one, and I think a sound one. Rudge entered the solicitor's office disguised as a messenger boy. He's small and youthful enough in appearance to pass for one at a distance. Stole the papers while the clerk's attention was elsewhere, and intended to sell his knowledge of the family's disgrace to Merivale himself, or failing that to the newspapers. Miss Denby's duplicate key, I now believe, was nothing more than an unrelated act of carelessness on someone's part, unconnected with the theft proper. I confess that the theory possessed, upon first hearing, a certain persuasive symmetry, and I said as much to Holmes as we were shown into the cell where Rudge sat, a thin, anxious youth of perhaps 19, whose hands shook as he answered our questions. "The banknotes are worthless, sir," said he, when Holmes inquired directly. "Theatrical money, nothing more, given me by my cousin, who plays small parts at the Alhambra. I kept them as a curiosity, thinking to frame one, for they are prettily printed. As for the clipping, it was sent me anonymous 3 days since through the post, with no letter accompanying it. I thought it queer at the time, but I am a poor hand at reading meanings into queer things, Mr. Holmes, and I let it lie. And the scarf? Torn these 6 months, sir, since I caught it on a fence paling in Merivale House garden, the very week before my dismissal. Ask any of the servants there, they will tell you I wore it so before ever Sir Claudius died." "Can you account for your whereabouts during the half-hour of the theft?" Holmes asked, though gently, for the boy's evident distress moved even my friend's customary reserve. Rudge shook his head miserably. "I was walking, sir, alone, having no work and less appetite for company in my circumstances. I cannot prove where I was, more's the pity, for an innocent man's word seems to count for little against a scarf and a handful of playhouse money." We left him to Lestrade's continued satisfaction, and returned that same afternoon to Merivale House, where a fresh disturbance awaited us. Sir Claudius's study, which had remained locked since his death, had been broken into during the night. A cabinet containing family correspondence had been forced and searched, though nothing, so far as the household could determine, had actually been taken. "Nothing but this," said Eleanor Merivale, who met us at the study door with an expression of mingled distress and bewilderment, and held out a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. It was a miniature portrait, no larger than the palm of my hand, set in a tarnished silver frame, and it had been found, she told us, lying face down upon the carpet beneath the cabinet, as though dropped or deliberately cast aside by the intruder. Holmes took it from her with a care that told me at once its importance had struck him. The portrait depicted a young woman of perhaps 20 years, dark-haired, with a grave and rather beautiful countenance, painted in the delicate style fashionable some 30 years before. "Do you know who this is?" Holmes asked. "I've never seen her before in my life," Eleanor answered. "Nor has Adrian, so far as he has told me. We supposed at first it might be some connection of Lady Honoria's, for she alone among us remembers our uncle's youth with any clearness." Holmes turned the frame over, and upon its reverse discovered a small faded stamp, the mark of a photographer's studio bearing the legend of an establishment in Brighton, together with a date some 30 years distant. "Margaret Vale," Lady Honoria pronounced when the portrait was shown to her a short while later, her voice carrying a sudden and unmistakable chill. "My cousin. She's supposed to have died abroad many years since. I had not thought to see her face again in this house." She would say nothing further upon the subject, save that the matter was a painful one, long buried, and best left so. It was Edwin Marsh, however, who most engaged my attention when the portrait was shown to him. He examined it with every appearance of polite indifference, turning it once in his hand before returning it to Holmes. "I have never seen her before," said he, in a voice as level and unremarkable as ever. "A relation of the family, I should suppose, from some earlier generation. Sir Claudius kept many such likenesses among his effects, though I confess I never troubled to inquire into their history." The words themselves were unremarkable enough, and delivered with a composure that would have satisfied any casual observer. But I, standing somewhat nearer to Marsh than Holmes, observed that his hand, resting upon the back of a chair as he spoke, had tightened suddenly about the wood until the knuckles showed pale, and that this tension endured some moments after his voice had already returned to its habitual mildness. I said nothing at the time, judging the observation too slight to signify, but that evening, as we sat once more before our own fire in Baker Street, I mentioned it to Holmes, half expecting to be told I had imagined the whole. "You did not imagine it, Watson," said he, gazing into the flames with an expression I had come to associate with the earlier stirrings of a solution not yet fully formed. A man's hands are less practised in deception than his countenance, for we are taught from childhood to govern our faces, but seldom our fingers. Mr. Marsh has told us a lie tonight, though a small one, and I begin to suspect that this quiet, helpful, unremarkable gentleman is a good deal more central to our little mystery than either his manner or his position would suggest. Chapter 5, The Secret of Margaret Vale. The secret of... The days that followed brought a marked alteration in the character of Holmes's inquiries. Where before he had concerned himself chiefly with locks, dust, and the movements of persons about a solicitor's office, he now turned his attention almost wholly to the more distant past, questioning each member of the Merivale circle less about the theft itself than about the history of the family, and in particular about the years of Sir Claudius's youth. It was Lady Honoria who yielded at length the first substantial portion of the truth, though not without considerable reluctance. We found her alone in the small morning room of Merivale House, and Holmes approached the subject with a directness that seemed almost unkind, until I understood that he had judged, correctly as it proved, that any gentler method would have met only with further evasion. "Tell me of Margaret Vale," said he. Lady Honoria's composure, so formidable upon our earlier visits, faltered visibly at the name. She was silent some moments before she spoke, and when she did, her voice had lost much of its accustomed authority. "She was my cousin," said she, "and in her youth engaged to be married to my brother Claudius. It was thought a fortunate match on both sides, for she was a girl of great charm if modest fortune, and he was already master of a considerable inheritance. The engagement ended, Mr. Holmes, in circumstances that brought disgrace upon her name. A valuable sapphire, an heirloom of this family, disappeared from my mother's jewel case, and suspicion settled upon Margaret, who had been alone in the room shortly before it was missed. She protested her innocence, but the evidence, such as it was, told heavily against her, and my brother, to his lasting shame, did not defend her as a man who truly loved her would have done. She left England within the month, and we heard some years later that she had died abroad. "You believe this report?" Holmes asked. "I had no cause to doubt it," said Lady Honoria, until a portrait I had thought lost with the rest of her memory was found lying face down beneath a broken cabinet in my brother's study. Holmes pressed her no further upon this point, but sought out Dr. Carrow that same afternoon, and found him, as before, willing enough to speak of Sir Claudius's bodily health, and curiously reluctant upon the subject of his final weeks. "I will tell you this much, Mr. Holmes, since I perceive you will have it from someone, if not from me," said the physician at length, drawing his chair a little nearer the fire as though the confidence required warmth to be spoken at all. "Some 10 days before his death, Sir Claudius received a visitor alone in this very study, and the interview left him profoundly disturbed. He would not name his visitor to me, nor would he explain the nature of the disturbance, save to say that a matter long buried had risen again to trouble him. That same evening he sent for Edwin Marsh, and instructed him to travel to the bank the following morning and retrieve certain sealed letters from a deposit box held there in Sir Claudius's own name. I do not know what those letters contained. I know only that my patient's health, already frail, declined markedly from that day forward, though his mind, I repeat, remained entirely sound. Adrian Merivale, when questioned upon the same afternoon, professed complete ignorance of Margaret Vale and her history, and I believed him sincere, for his bewilderment upon hearing the name seemed genuine enough. His sister Eleanor, however, recalled a fragment of conversation that struck Holmes forcibly. "My uncle said a strange thing to me not long before he died," said she. "He told me that a dead woman had returned to demand justice. I thought it merely the fancy of a sick man, Mr. Holmes, and did not press him to explain it. I have wondered since whether I ought to have done." "You could not have known its meaning," Holmes said gently, "and I think, Miss Merivale, that your uncle himself scarcely wished you to know it then." That evening we returned to the offices of Wren, Bellamy and Pike, where Holmes turned his attention once more to the matter of Miss Denby's duplicate key, a subject he had, until now, seemed almost to neglect. He examined the key with his lens for a considerable time, comparing it minutely against the original, which Bellamy produced with evident reluctance from his watch chain. "The resemblance, as Lestrade observed, is close," said Holmes at last, "but it is not identity. The teeth of this duplicate are similar in general pattern to the original, close enough to deceive a casual glance, but they differ at the second and fifth positions by a fraction no greater than the width of a hair, and no lock so constructed would yield to so imperfect a copy. This key, Miss Denby, could never have opened that box, whatever purpose it was made to serve." Miss Denby, summoned to hear this pronouncement, showed less relief than I had expected and more distress. "The blue paper found in my desk," said she in a low voice, "is not the wrapper from the stolen packet, Mr. Holmes, though I could not have proved it before now. I know the texture of our official paper as well as I know my own hand, and that scrap is coarser, cheaper, such as might be bought at any stationer's in London." "Then how came it into your desk?" Holmes asked. Miss Denby hesitated a long while before answering, and when she spoke it was with the manner of one confessing a private grief rather than a crime. "Some weeks before the theft, Mr. Griggs asked whether he might borrow a stick of sealing wax from my desk to make an impression of Mr. Bellamy's key, saying that the firm required a spare against the day the original should be lost or damaged. I refused him, thinking the request irregular, but I cannot swear that he did not take a portion of the wax without my knowledge. I have often left my desk unlocked during the working day." At this, Lionel Griggs, who had been summoned along with the others, denied the accusation hotly, and countered with a charge of his own that struck the room into a sudden and uncomfortable silence. "She protects Adrian Merivale," said he, "as she has always done, for they were secretly engaged these 2 years past before his gambling drove her family to refuse the match. If he gains his inheritance, he may yet renew the engagement, or at the least discharge her mother's debts. Ask her whether that is not motive enough for a woman in want." Miss Denby's face at this turned first crimson and then very pale, but she did not deny it, and Holmes, I observed, made no immediate comment upon so damaging a revelation, though I saw him note it carefully in that small book he carried always in his breast pocket. It was only as we walked homeward through streets now clearing at last of their perpetual fog that Holmes returned to a matter which had, throughout the afternoon's revelations, plainly occupied the greater part of his attention. "The powder from the dispatch box, Watson," said he, "I have had analysed. It is a fine plaster compound, of the sort used by locksmiths and by certain other tradesmen, for taking impressions of small objects such as keys. Miss Denby's confession of the borrowed wax fits neatly enough into that pattern, and yet I confess the pattern troubles me more than it satisfies me. A false key, clumsily made, opens nothing, and a clumsy thief, Watson, does not vanish a document from a locked box without leaving behind him some far clearer trace of his clumsiness than a scrap of paper and a badly cut key." Chapter 6. A Reconstruction in Silence. It was Holmes's habit, in cases that had grown tangled through an excess of testimony, rather than a want of it, to withdraw altogether from the society of witnesses, and return alone to the scene of the crime, there to reconstruct events with his own hands rather than trust further to the recollections of others. So it was that we found ourselves, 2 evenings later, once more within the offices of Wren, Bellamy and Pike. Though the hour was late, the clerks departed, and only a single gas jet burning in the outer office to relieve the darkness. Bellamy had been persuaded, with some difficulty, to grant us the freedom of the premises after hours, and had then, to my private relief, taken himself off to his club, declaring that he had no wish to witness further disturbance of an affair he had begun to regard as a family humiliation rather than a mere theft. Holmes, thus left to his own devices, set about his work with a thoroughness that I confess tried my patience before the evening was out. He began by measuring the corridor between Bellamy's private room and the deed room, pacing its length twice with a small tape, and noting the result in his book. He timed, by his watch, the opening and closing of each door along the passage, and observed, with evident satisfaction, the manner in which the gas lamps cast their shadows at this hour, remarking that the light at 5:30 in November would have been very little different from the light we now saw before us. "You will oblige me, Watson, by playing the part of Miss Denby," said he, pressing into my hands a bundle of papers tied with string, in imitation, I supposed, of the leases she had carried that evening. "Enter by the outer door, cross to the second cabinet, and remain there some 5 minutes, as she has told us she did, before withdrawing." I performed this small piece of theatre as instructed, feeling, I confess, rather foolish in the empty office, while Holmes stood in the shadow of the deed-room door, watch in hand, observing my movements with the same close attention he might have given a chemical experiment. He repeated the exercise himself in the character of Griggs, walking briskly through the corridor with an armful of letters bound for the pillar box, and again as Marsh, entering unannounced to inquire, in a voice pitched to Carrie, whether the probate papers might be delivered directly to Merivale House. Throughout these repeated exercises I observed one curious fact, which I mentioned to Holmes only when he had at last set down his watch and stood regarding the dispatch box itself, still resting upon its shelf where Bellamy had left it. "You have not once attempted to open the box," said I. "I have no need to open it," Holmes replied. "I have need only to examine how it is made." And with that he lifted the box from its shelf, turned it upside down upon the table, and began a minute inspection of its lid, running his fingers along the inner seam where the metal plate met the velvet lining. "Here, Watson," said he presently, and I bent to look where he indicated. Between the outer plate of the lid and the velvet that lined its underside there existed a narrow gap, scarcely the width of a stout card running the full length of the box. Holmes pressed gently upon one corner of the velvet, and I saw it yield ever so slightly, revealing a shallow cavity between the metal and the lining, sufficient, I judged, to conceal a document of no great thickness. A thin packet, pressed flat and slipped within this space, might rest here undetected by any but the most searching eye, said Holmes, and might be withdrawn again by the same means at any later hour, without ever troubling the lock at all. The scratches I noted upon the brass rim, do you recall them? They are consistent with a thin, flat instrument, a palette knife or its like, employed to widen this gap sufficiently to admit or withdraw such a packet. Then the papers were never stolen from a locked box at all, said I, beginning at last to grasp the shape of his reasoning, but hidden within it before ever it was locked, and removed afterward, when the box stood open and unwatched. It is a possibility that satisfies every fact we have so far gathered, and contradicts none, said Holmes, though I do not yet say it is the truth. Let us proceed to the second matter. He knelt again beside the desk where he had earlier discovered the small circular stain, and drew from his pocket a fresh sample of the same substance scraped with great care from the boards. The analysis is complete, Watson. This is spirit gum, of a variety commonly employed in the fixing of false beards, wigs, and other appurtenances of theatrical disguise. A man who wished to enter these offices unrecognised as a messenger boy, let us say, or in some other humble character, might apply such an article to his own countenance, and might, in the haste of removing or adjusting it, set down the small bottle carelessly enough to leave behind him just such a mark as this. It was at this point that Holmes returned to the office messenger, a sleepy youth roused from his lodgings nearby, and brought back to the scene with the promise of a shilling for his trouble, and questioned him afresh upon the telegram delivered during the crucial half-hour. "It came from Merivale House, sir," the boy said, rubbing his eyes. "I mind it particular, for the address was wrote very fine, and I remember thinking a secretary must have penned it. The hand was that neat and practised. Can you say who was present when the message was written?" "There was a gentleman stood by, sir, thin and sandy-haired, watching over the clerk's shoulder, as it were, though he said nothing to me directly." Holmes's eyes met mine across the dim office, and I understood, without need of further words, the significance of this small confirmation, for Edwin Marsh had told us plainly, upon our first visit to Merivale House, that he had left the house well before any such telegram could have been dispatched. "Our circle narrows, Watson, though it does not yet close," said Holmes, as we walked homeward beneath a sky at last free of fog, the stars showing faint and cold above the chimney-pots. "Consider the motives now arrayed before us. Adrian fears ruin, and has debts enough to drive a weaker man to worse than theft. Lady Honoria fears the resurrection of an old family disgrace, and has shown herself willing enough to speak ill of a will she stands to gain by overturning. Dr. O'Carroll conceals something of Sir Claudius's final illness, though I do not yet know what, or why. Griggs is ambitious, and no friend to honesty where advancement is concerned. Miss Denby, we now know, loves foolishly, and perhaps still hopes to be repaid for her folly." "And Marsh?" I asked. "Marsh alone, among all this company, appears to want nothing," said Holmes slowly. "He has no debts that we have discovered, no quarrel, no ambition beyond his station, no fortune to gain by any turn the estate might take. He claims only loyalty to a dead employer, and I have long observed, Watson, that loyalty, when it is genuine, may drive a man very much further along a dangerous road than greed ever could, for greed calculates its risks, while loyalty does not trouble to count the cost at all." Chapter 7. A Confession at Scotland Yard. We had scarcely finished breakfast the following morning when a second telegram arrived from Lestrade, its tone conveying, even through the clipped economy of that medium, a satisfaction bordering upon triumph. Lionel Griggs, it announced, had vanished from his lodgings during the night and had been apprehended before dawn attempting to board a boat train at Victoria Station, carrying with him a forged passport and a sum of several £100 in notes of unimpeachable authenticity. "Come, Watson," said Holmes, folding the telegram with an expression I could not quite read. I confess I had not looked for so dramatic a development, though I cannot say it wholly surprises me. We found Lestrade at Scotland Yard in a state of scarcely concealed elation, pacing before his desk with the restless energy of a man who has at last been proved right after long and trying doubt. "He has confessed the whole affair, Mr. Holmes," said the inspector, before we had well crossed the threshold. "Confessed freely and in considerable detail. I confess I had my suspicions of Griggs from the first, whatever appearances suggested elsewhere." Griggs himself, when we were shown into the room where he sat under guard, presented a very different figure from the sharp, self-possessed clerk we had questioned at Lincoln's Inn. His restless eyes were now hollow with fatigue, his collar disordered, and his hands, when he lifted them to his face, trembled with the particular unsteadiness of a man who has not slept in the shadow of his own wrongdoing. "I stole the letters of probate," said he, in a low, rapid voice, as though the words once begun could not be checked before their appointed end. "Adrian Merivale paid me to do it. He wished the administration of the estate delayed, that certain debts and irregularities in his own accounts might be quietly settled before ever the executor's authority passed formally into his hands. I made an impression of Mr. Bellamy's key in plaster, some weeks before, using wax borrowed, though she did not know it, from Miss Denby's desk. On the evening in question, I let myself into the deed-room, opened the dispatch box, removed the packet, and passed it that same night to Thomas Rudge, who was to hold it until I could arrange for its destruction." Lestrade regarded us with an air of vindicated satisfaction as this recital proceeded, and indeed the confession, taken upon its own terms, wove together threads that had appeared, until that moment, stubbornly disconnected. The plaster dust within the box, the borrowed wax, the duplicate key, even Rudge's unhappy proximity to papers he had always sworn he never touched. "Adrian's bank records," Lestrade added, producing a slip of paper with evident relish, "confirm a payment to Griggs of some £40, made 2 days before the theft. I have sent for Mr. Merivale already. I think we may regard this case as very nearly closed, Mr. Holmes, whatever elegant theories you may have been constructing in the meanwhile." Adrian Merivale, summoned within the hour, denied the accusation with a heat that seemed to me entirely genuine, though I own my judgment upon such matters had been tried severely by the events of the preceding week. "I paid Griggs, yes," said he, his voice unsteady with anger and something that might have been fear, "but not for this. I paid him for information, Mr. Holmes, concerning the value and disposition of my uncle's estate, that I might know, before the formal grant, how great a sum I stood to inherit, and arrange my own affairs accordingly. It was foolish, perhaps dishonourable, but it was not theft, and I swear before God I never asked him to touch those papers." Lestrade received this protest with the tolerant scepticism of a man who has heard 100 such denials, and found them, upon examination, uniformly false. Rudge, brought once more before the inspector, was released from the gravest of the charges laid against him, though Lestrade continued to regard him as an intermediary in the affair, a mere carrier of stolen goods rather than its author. Miss Denby's part, meanwhile, was dismissed with a shrug as an act of romantic foolishness, unworthy of further pursuit now that a fuller and more satisfying confession had been obtained. I confess that I found myself very nearly persuaded by the completeness of the case as Lestrade now presented it. The money, the duplicate key, Adrian's desperate financial circumstances, all combined into a narrative of such apparent coherence that I remarked as much to Holmes as we stood together in the corridor outside. "It explains a great deal, certainly," Holmes agreed, though his tone carried none of the satisfaction I had expected. "It explains the money, and the key, and Adrian's undoubted desperation. What it does not explain, Watson, is a small matter I have not yet mentioned to our friend Lestrade. He returned to the room where Griggs sat and addressed him with a question so simple and so seemingly beside the point that Lestrade's brow furrowed in open impatience. "Describe to me, if you please, Mr. Griggs, the appearance of the letters of probate as you removed them from the box." Griggs hesitated but a moment before answering, as though relieved to find, amid so exhausting an interrogation, a question he could meet with confidence. "They bore a broad red seal, Mr. Holmes, hanging from a length of green ribbon in the old fashion. I remember it particularly, for the ribbon caught upon the box's hinge as I drew the packet free, and I feared for a moment it might tear." Holmes said nothing for a long moment, and I saw a change come over his countenance, subtle but unmistakable, the look of a man who has heard at last the single false note that betrays an entire performance as counterfeit. "Thank you, Mr. Griggs," said he quietly. "That will be all." We took our leave shortly afterward, Lestrade still glowing with the satisfaction of a case he believed triumphantly concluded, and it was not until we stood once more in the cold air outside Scotland Yard that Holmes permitted himself to speak. "English grants of probate, Watson, issued by the court in the ordinary course of business, bear no hanging seal upon a ribbon, red, green, or otherwise. They are stamped documents, plain in form, however grave their legal consequence. What Mr. Griggs has described to us so confidently is not the appearance of a genuine legal grant at all, but the appearance of a document from some romance or melodrama, a medieval charter such as a man might imagine who has never in his life set eyes upon the real thing. Then his confession is worthless, Watson, or worse than worthless, for it is worthless dressed as truth. Griggs has confessed, with every appearance of sincerity, to stealing a packet he has never once laid eyes upon. Someone has purchased that confession from him, as surely as one purchases a suit of clothes, and has fitted it, imperfectly, to a body it was never cut to fit. Chapter 8. The Second Packet. "A purchased confession, Watson, is a curious commodity," said Holmes, as our cab carried us westward through streets now busy with the ordinary traffic of the morning. "It costs the purchaser something, and it costs the seller a great deal more, for Griggs has bound himself by his own words to a charge that may yet see him transported, or worse, and all to shield some hand he has not named, and perhaps does not himself fully know." "You believe, then, that Adrian's payment to him was genuine, yet unrelated to the theft?" "I believe it very probable," said Holmes. "A young man in want of ready information concerning his inheritance might well bribe a clerk to furnish it in advance of the formal grant, and such a transaction, however irregular, explains the sum recorded in Adrian's bank book without implicating him in a crime he plainly did not commit. The theft required no such payment, Watson, for its author had access enough and motive enough without recourse to bribery at all." We had scarcely returned to Merivale House to pursue this reasoning further when a fresh disturbance overtook us, one which threatened, for a time, to undo every careful inference Holmes had constructed. Before Lestrade could act upon his stated intention of charging Griggs with obstructing the course of justice, a search of Adrian Merivale's own bedroom, conducted at Lady Honoria's urgent insistence, brought to light a second packet, wrapped in blue legal paper and secreted within the false bottom of a travelling case. It proved, upon examination, to contain the missing letters of probate themselves, together with the handwritten memorandum whose loss had first summoned Holmes to the affair. I have rarely seen a room so swiftly transformed from uncertainty to accusation as the drawing-room of Merivale House became in the half-hour that followed this discovery. Lady Honoria, her composure entirely restored by what she plainly regarded as complete vindication, demanded Adrian's immediate arrest in a voice that admitted no argument. Bellamy, summoned in haste from Lincoln's Inn, declared the family disgraced beyond any hope of quiet resolution, and paced the room wringing his hands after the fashion of a man rehearsing, even in his distress, the language he would presently employ before a client. "The papers were found in his own room, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, not without a certain grim satisfaction at having his original suspicions thus, as he supposed, confirmed by a route he had not himself anticipated. His payment to Griggs is established beyond dispute. His debts are notorious throughout half the clubs of London. I do not see what further evidence any jury could reasonably require." I confess that I too found the weight of circumstance almost overwhelming. The papers discovered in a locked room to which Adrian alone held the key, the documented payment, the desperate financial straits so freely admitted by the young man himself. Together they formed a chain of evidence that seemed, upon the surface, scarcely capable of any other interpretation. Adrian himself protested his innocence with a vehemence that bordered upon despair. "I never placed those papers there, Mr. Holmes. I swear it before every soul in this room. Someone has done this to ruin me, though I cannot conceive who or why they should choose so cruel a means." Holmes, throughout this scene of mounting accusation, had remained curiously withdrawn, examining the recovered packet with the same close and patient attention he had earlier given the empty dispatch box, apparently indifferent to the drama unfolding around him. It was only when Lestrade, growing impatient, demanded whether he had any objection to raise against so complete a solution that Holmes at last looked up. "I have one small objection," said he, "though I think, when you have heard it, you will agree it is not so very small after all." He held up the blue wrapper for the company to examine, indicating a portion of its surface near one corner. "You will observe here, upon the paper, a dry, rectangular patch, somewhat paler than the surrounding sheet, as though a small label had once been affixed there and afterward removed." "What of it?" Lestrade demanded. "Only this," said Holmes, turning to Percival Wren, who stood somewhat apart from the others, pale and evidently as troubled as I was myself by this unexpected turn in the proceedings. "You described to me, upon the very first evening of our acquaintance, the manner in which the original packet was prepared. Do you recall your words?" "I said only that the wrapper was newly cut from a fresh sheet of our office paper," Wren answered slowly, "and marked directly in ink, with the name of the estate and the date of the grant. There was no label, Mr. Holmes, I am certain of it. Mr. Bellamy wrote directly upon the paper itself, as is our invariable custom." "Then the wrapper before us," said Holmes, laying it upon the table with a gesture almost gentle in its finality, "is not, and cannot be, the original in which the letters of probate were first enclosed. It is a careful imitation, prepared by someone who knew the general appearance of such a packet, but who worked from description rather than from direct observation, and who employed, perhaps from an old office stock, a sheet of paper that had once borne a label of some other purpose entirely." A silence fell upon the room, broken at last by Bellamy himself, who had drawn nearer to examine the memorandum with an expression of dawning and troubled recognition. "There is a further discrepancy, Mr. Holmes, now that you press the matter," said he, unfolding the handwritten sheet with visibly unsteady hands. "This memorandum has been folded in 4 sections. I have always, throughout 30 years of practice, folded my private correspondence in 3, to fit the case I carry for such papers. I did not fold this document as it now appears before us. I could not have done so." "Then someone," said Holmes, addressing the room at large, "has taken considerable pains to reconstruct, from second-hand descriptions rather than from the genuine articles themselves, a packet sufficiently convincing to satisfy a hasty examination, and has placed it where its discovery must inevitably fall upon Mr. Adrian Merivale. It is a clever device, and very nearly successful. But a forger of documents, like a forger of confessions, is betrayed always by the small particulars he cannot have known, precisely because he was never permitted to see the truth he attempts to imitate." Lestrade's countenance throughout this explanation had passed through several stages of resistance before settling with evident reluctance into a grudging attentiveness. "You are suggesting, Mr. Holmes, that both the confession and this packet are the work of the same hand." "I am suggesting a great deal more than that," said Holmes, and I saw in his eyes, as he spoke, the particular light that told me he had at last drawn together every scattered thread of the affair into a single, coherent pattern. "I am suggesting that we have none of us yet met the true author of this theft, though we have all of us, upon one occasion or another, spoken with him quite freely, and thought him, I dare say, the least remarkable person in the room. Chapter 9. The Man Who Had No Past. Holmes requested that the entire circle be gathered once more in the drawing-room of Merivale House upon the following evening, and I confess that I have rarely, in all our long association, observed him prepare for such an occasion with quite so grave a deliberation. He spoke little upon the journey thither, and what he did say concerned matters so far removed from the case at hand, the breeding of bees, if I recall aright, that I understood him to be occupied with thoughts he did not yet wish to share, even with me. The company assembled slowly, and with evident unease. Adrian and Eleanor Merivale sat together near the fire, the young man's countenance still marked by the strain of accusation not yet lifted. Lady Honoria occupied her accustomed chair with an air of wary dignity. Dr. Carrow stood somewhat apart, as though reluctant to commit himself to any faction until the matter should be finally resolved. Bellamy and Wren had come from Lincoln's Inn, and Lestrade, summoned by Holmes himself, arrived last of all, his manner a curious blend of professional scepticism and undeniable curiosity. Edwin Marsh alone seemed entirely composed, seated a little apart from the rest, his hands folded quietly in his lap. "I have asked you here," Holmes began when all were settled, "to bring to its conclusion an affair which has, from its very outset, concerned itself less with the theft of a legal document than with the far older theft of a woman's good name." He turned first to the matter of the false trails that had in turn ensnared each innocent party. Miss Denby's duplicate key was never capable of opening the dispatch box, and was planted among her possessions, together with a scrap of paper never taken from the true wrapper, by someone who wished suspicion to fall first, and most conveniently, upon the person least able to defend herself. Thomas Rudge's scarf, torn many months before the theft, supplied a fibre pressed deliberately into the deed-room door-frame that an innocent grievance might be mistaken for a criminal one. Lionel Griggs was persuaded, by means I need not yet specify, to confess to a crime he had never committed, and betrayed himself only by describing a seal that no genuine grant of probate has ever borne. The packet discovered in Mr. Merivale's room was a careful forgery, built from description rather than sight, and betrayed in its turn by a label mark upon paper never truly labelled, and a fold no true clerk of this office would ever have made. "Then who," demanded Lady Honoria, "is responsible for so elaborate a deception?" "The theft itself required neither a stolen key nor any prolonged absence from that corridor," Holmes continued unhurried. "The dispatch box, as I have since demonstrated to Mr. Bellamy's own satisfaction, conceals a narrow space between its outer plate and its velvet lining, sufficient to receive a thin packet without disturbing the lock at all. On the evening of the theft, a false packet, prepared beforehand, was placed within the box in place of the genuine papers, which were slid by means of a thin blade into that concealed space in the lid, there to remain until the confusion attending the box's apparent emptiness had passed. The true papers were removed only later, quietly, by someone who returned to the office unnoticed amid the general disturbance that followed Mr. Bellamy's discovery." "The telegram," I said, unable to restrain myself. "The one written under the eye of a thin, sandy-haired gentleman." "Precisely, Watson. The spirit gun beneath the desk came from a disguise worn earlier that same day, when our unremarkable friend presented himself at the solicitor's office in the character of a messenger boy, a character he could assume with tolerable ease, being slight of build and accustomed, by long practice, to passing through rooms unnoticed. The reddish thread at the door was no accident of ordinary wear, but a fragment deliberately taken from Roger's old scarf and pressed into the frame to await our discovery. Every eye in the room had by now turned toward Edwin Marsh, who sat unmoving, his expression composed but very pale, as a man might appear who watches, from a shore he cannot leave, the slow approach of a tide he has long known must eventually reach him. "Edwin Marsh," said Holmes, and his voice, though quiet, carried through the room with the finality of a closing door, is not the name this gentleman was born to. He is, in truth, Edward Vale, the son of Margaret Vale." A murmur ran through the assembled company, and Lady Honoria half rose from her chair before sinking back, her hand pressed to her lips. "Margaret Vale never stole the sapphire for which she was disgraced," Holmes continued. "Sir Claudius himself sold the stone privately to satisfy debts he dared not confess to his family, and permitted her, out of cowardice rather than malice, to bear a blame that was never rightly hers. She fled England, Lady Honoria, not from guilt, but from a shame not her own, and she carried with her a child of whose existence Sir Claudius remained, for 30 years, entirely ignorant." Marcia, or Vale, as I must now call him, spoke for the first time, his voice steady though very low. "My mother raised me abroad, Mr. Holmes, in modest circumstances, and told me only that my father was a gentleman of England who had wronged her grievously. I came to this country some years since, under an assumed name, and entered Sir Claudius's service without any thought of vengeance, only of observation, of learning, at close quarters, the character of the man who had ruined her. I had not intended that he should ever know me." "Yet he discovered you," said Holmes. "He did," Vale answered, his composure faltering at last. "Some private paper, some chance resemblance, I never learned precisely how, revealed the truth to him some months before his death. He was overcome with guilt, Mr. Holmes, more than I had thought so proud a man capable of feeling. He resolved to add a formal declaration to his estate papers, clearing my mother's name publicly and granting me a share of the fortune he believed too late he owed her. The handwritten memorandum contained the beginning of that confession." "And you stole it," said Lestrade, finding his voice at last. "Your own vindication, along with the rest." "I feared it incomplete," Vale said. "The memorandum spoke of my mother's disgrace, Inspector, but had not yet reached the full proof of her innocence, which lay, I believed, among certain letters my father had instructed me to retrieve from his bank not long before his death. I dared not let so partial and damaging a confession become public before I could secure the letters that would complete it. I searched the study, hoping to find them there. I found instead that they had already vanished. All eyes turned once more, and this time it was Lady Honoria who met them, her earlier defiance dissolved entirely into something nearer grief. "I took them," said she quietly. "I found them among my brother's effects, and I destroyed what I dared, and hid the rest, for they proved that this family had known all along that Margaret was innocent, and had permitted her ruin rather than confess our own." Holmes allowed this confession its full weight before continuing. "There remains one matter I have not yet accounted for. The false packet discovered in Mr. Merivale's room was not the work of Mr. Vale, whose only object was concealment, not accusation. That device, I believe, was fashioned by someone who wished not merely to hide the truth, but to direct suspicion decisively away from this family's disgrace, and toward a scapegoat already burdened with debt and misfortune." "I did not plant it," Vale said quickly. "I swear that before God, Mr. Holmes." "I believe you," Holmes replied, and turned, with a gentleness that seemed to me almost merciful, toward Lady Honoria herself. "For it was you, was it not, who hoped that Adrian's ruin might purchase your family's continued silence?" Lady Honoria didn't answer, but her silence, in that hushed and firelit room, spoke with a completeness that no further words could have improved upon. Chapter 10. The Honour of the Dead. The weeks that followed brought with them the slow, unglamorous machinery by which the law resolves what passion and concealment had so thoroughly entangled. Lady Honoria Vale was charged with conspiracy, with the destruction of evidence material to the estate, and with attempting to pervert the course of an investigation she had herself, in the beginning, been so eager to encourage. She received the news of her arrest, I am told, with the same unbending dignity that had characterized her throughout our acquaintance, though Eleanor confided to me afterward that something in the old woman's bearing had altered irrevocably from that evening onward, as though the effort of 30 years' concealment once abandoned had left nothing behind to sustain her. Lionel Griggs faced prosecution for his false confession and his attempted flight from justice, though Holmes, when consulted upon the point, expressed the opinion that the young man's chief crime had been weakness rather than malice, and that whoever had purchased his confession, a matter which emerged in the course of subsequent inquiry, to have been arranged through an intermediary acting upon Lady Honoria's private instructions, bore the heavier share of guilt for what had followed. Adrian Merivale was cleared entirely of the theft that had so nearly ruined him, though his dealings with Griggs, however innocent of the greater charge, exposed a want of principle that Bellamy, and indeed Holmes himself, judged sufficient to disqualify him from any position of unsupervised trust. It was decided, after some negotiation among the family's advisers, that Eleanor Merivale should be appointed joint administrator of the estate, together with an independent solicitor of unimpeachable standing, and that Adrian should receive his own inheritance only under conditions of strict financial oversight, a settlement which he accepted, I am glad to record, with considerably more grace than his earlier conduct might have led one to expect. Miss Denby's engagement to Adrian, revived so briefly by the desperate hope that his fortune might restore what his gambling had cost her family, came finally to an end of her own choosing. "I find," she told Holmes when he called upon her some days later to return the false key that had so nearly condemned her, "that affection cannot long survive the discovery of repeated dishonesty, however dearly one may once have valued it. I bear him no ill will, Mr. Holmes. I have simply ceased to trust him, and I do not think trust, once so thoroughly spent, can easily be earned again." It was Edwin Marsh, or Edward Vale, as the world now knew him, who occupied the greater share of Holmes's concern in those final weeks. He returned the original letters of probate himself, together with the memorandum he had taken, placing them into Bellamy's hands with a composure that seemed to me, knowing what I now knew of his history, a kind of quiet courage rather than mere resignation. "He stole to protect his mother's memory, not to enrich himself," Holmes observed to Bellamy, when the solicitor pressed, somewhat uncertainly, for guidance upon what course the law should properly take. "The documents are recovered whole, and no material harm has come to the estate through his actions, whatever anxiety they may have caused along the way." Bellamy, to his credit, proved more inclined toward leniency than his earlier pronouncements of family disgrace might have suggested, and urged, in his correspondence with the appropriate authorities, that the circumstances of Vale's offence be weighed with particular compassion. Holmes supported this view without reservation, though he was careful, in speaking with young Vale himself, to draw a distinction I thought characteristic of his whole philosophy. "I will not pretend to you," said he, "that a noble motive transforms deception into lawful conduct, Mr. Vale, for the law recognises no such alchemy, and I confess I am not certain it should. But I have found, in a long career among the failings of my fellow men, that the world seldom troubles to distinguish between the thief who steals from cruelty and the thief who steals from love, and I have thought it worth the trouble on this occasion to make that distinction plain to those who will decide your fate. The complete letters recovered from Lady Honoria's keeping, once produced before the proper authorities, proved beyond any further dispute the truth of Margaret Vale's innocence, and Sir Claudius's final signed declaration, discovered among them, formally restored her reputation, and granted to Edward Vale a substantial share of the fortune his father had, in life, been too proud or too fearful to acknowledge openly. It was, I thought, a strange and belated justice, arriving 30 years too late to comfort the woman it most concerned, yet not perhaps too late to matter to her son. Some days after the affair had been thus concluded, Holmes and I sat once more before our own fire in Baker Street, the November fogs having given way at last to the clearer, colder skies of early December. I had been writing up my notes upon the case, as was my custom, and I remarked to Holmes, not without a certain satisfaction at having followed the reasoning through to its conclusion, that the matter had appeared, upon its surface, a simple enough affair, a locked box, a stolen legal document, and a desperate air. "It concerned something a good deal more common than any of those things, Watson," Holmes replied, knocking the ash from his pipe with the deliberate patience of a man well satisfied with an evening's rest. "It concerned respectable people mistaking concealed shame for preserved honour, a confusion I have observed in every stratum of society, from the meanest lodging-house to the grandest square in Belgravia, and one which causes, I dare say, a greater sum of human suffering than all the deliberate villainy in London combined." I considered his words some while in silence, turning over in my own mind the sequence of clues that had led us, by so circuitous a path, from a solicitor's empty dispatch box to a 30-year-old sapphire and a mother's exile. It seemed to me, upon reflection, that the decisive turn of the whole affair had lain neither in the forged key nor in the planted fibres, ingenious as those devices had been, but in two moments almost too slight to notice: a false description of a legal seal, spoken by a man who had never seen the thing he claimed to have stolen, and a quiet, involuntary gesture before a faded portrait, made by a man unable to endure, even in paint, the accusing gaze of a mother he had never known disgraced. "You are quite right, Watson, though I perceive you have already reasoned your way to the observation without my assistance," said Holmes, when I ventured to say as much aloud. "Reason succeeds in the end, not through the accumulation of the greatest number of facts, but through the recognition of that one small fact which cannot possibly belong to the story its possessor has chosen to tell. Everything else, my dear fellow, is merely patience, and the willingness to look a little longer than one's neighbours at what appears, to their eyes, already sufficiently explained." He said no more upon the subject that evening, and I did not press him further, content to sit a while, in the companionable silence of our old rooms, while beyond the windows the lamps of Baker Street burned steady and clear at last against a sky from which, for once, every trace of fog had wholly lifted. Pius nanti kixt pricasuia si pin kias.